There's been a lot of debate about the idea of flipped and blended learning. A lot of that has to do with how they're defined. Many people say that flipped is a subset of blended learning. Michael Horn and Heather Staker, in their book Blended, classified flipped classroom as a subset of blended learning. Actually, a subset of the rotation model of blended learning, right? A couple of years ago, I had a chance to have a conversation with Michael Horn, and we discussed this at some length. And he admitted that the definition he was using in his book, the book Blended, was that of flipped classrooms and not flipped learning. He acknowledged that flipped learning is something more, much more than was depicted in his book. So before we answer the question, blend or flip, let's hear about the importance of having a precise definition of flipped learning.
The conception of what flipped learning really means. I think a lot of people have a rather naive conception of it, thinking that flipped learning is simply watching videos before class. That's it, boom, done.
So if your understanding of flipped learning is what you just heard from Dr. Mazur, then you likely haven't been paying attention to how flipped learning has been evolving for a number of years. Let's hear from another professor who has weighed in on this issue.
Unfortunately, you can look around the educational landscape and see places where flipped learning gets abused. For example, flipped learning is encouraged because administrators may think we can increase class sizes because all the students are doing is homework in class, or maybe even removed trained teachers from the classroom and replacing them with teaching assistants instead, or just using flipped learning as an excuse to merely do passive video and boring worksheets in tandem. We want flipped learning to be this rich environment where students are working really hard, teachers are working really hard, and unless we have a definition to kind of say what it is, I think that we have a strong probability of that being misused in the classroom. And a second reason is that we really need better research on flipped learning, and you cannot research what you have not operationalized. And so when we see research publications on flipped learning, that could be vastly different things right now. It makes it very hard to look at research papers and generalize one person's finding to your classroom.
We must know what it is so that it isn't misused or misapplied, and also so that we can do legitimate research on the topic. So this is critical. So what is the definition of flipped learning? During the spring of 2018, the nonprofit organization, the Academy of Active Learning Arts and Sciences, launched the Flipped Learning Global Standards Project. One of ALAS's projects was to determine the global standards for flipped learning. One result of that project was a new definition of flipped learning. The project was co-chaired by Carolyn Felkerban of MEF University in Istanbul, Eric Mazur of Harvard University, Robin Brinks-Lockwood of Stanford University, Dr. Raul Santiago from the Universidad de La Rioja, Guojin Huang from National Taiwan University of Science, Technology, and myself. There were over 100 delegates from 47 countries. Suffice it to say, the process was extensive and represents the largest effort to define flipped learning since flipped learning began. The committee and the delegates determined that we need a new definition because it revealed a need for a common framework, a common terminology, and defined best practices. Practical problems surfaced quickly, starting with the definition of flipped learning. You see, educators, we often speak in our own language with buzzwords and lingo that can be confusing to peers from other countries and especially to non-educators. So the aim is to draft a precise, concise, and buzzword-free definition that can be more universally understood, not only by educators, but by the general public. So, drum roll, here is the new definition. Flipped learning is a framework that enables educators to reach every student. The flipped approach inverts the traditional classroom model by introducing course concepts before class, allowing educators to use in-class time to guide each student through active, practical, innovative applications of the course concepts. Notice that the new definition explains the result of flipped learning to reach every student. It's jargonless. Terms like individual space and group space are gone, and even the Bloom's-esque language is gone, though it is implied. The committee wanted this to be something you could share at a cocktail party with your non-educator friends while still maintaining the integrity of the process. Folks, this is important work and will set us up on the road to better research and, more importantly, better practice. On another note, this course is based upon these global best practices, these global standards. You can read the full list of the standards by going to this website. There you have it. The definition of flipped learning. Jargonless, cocktail party shareable, and more importantly, something we're now going to learn how to really implement with efficacy in our classrooms. Let's come back to our question from the top. Is flipped learning a subset of blended learning? Let's hear from a professor who wrote the first book about flipped learning in Arabic.
When I was talking about flipped learning a few years ago, I was talking about flipped learning within the blended learning. I authored a book in this area, and I was talking about flipped learning as a style of blended learning. A few years later, and the book was published in 2015. Now, 3 years after, I do believe flipped learning has emerged as different style, a different strategy, as different approach to teaching and learning. Flipped learning has distinguished itself as a separate domain from the other styles and approaches, which shows how fast it is, the development in this area. Various factors have contributed to this, of course, such as technology, advancement in learning theories, with much more focus on the pedagogical side of the flipped learning.
Flipped learning has come a long way. It started as flipped classrooms, videos at home and homework in class. But hopefully you can now see that it's evolved and it's become its own separate learning strategy. In fact, the extensive process whereby flipped learning was defined, I think the 100 people, 49 countries, speaks to how it has changed. What about blended learning? Horn and Staker defined blended learning as a formal program in which a student learns, at least in part through online learning, with some element of student control over time, place, path, and/or pace, at least a part in a supervised brick-and-mortar location away from home, and the modalities along each student's learning path within a course or subject are connected to provide an integrated learning experience. So let's be honest, both blended and flipped learning utilize some of the same technology. Learning management systems, online resources such as curated video, teacher-created video in some cases, online interactives, and online readings. Both strategies see the value of student and teacher agency and building choice into all learning environments. The differences. So blended says it has to have sort of that technology piece. Some part of it must be online. But Flip says that there are people, this is crazy, maybe you don't know this, but there are people who are flipping without technology. Now, most of the times, maybe 80%, 90% of a flipped class, so it doesn't require tech, where blended requires tech. And secondly, blended has many models. I forget, is there 7 many models, something like that. There's all these models, so it's sort of this sort of big idea, and flipped is very precise definition. And remember, what's the key word we talked about a little earlier? Reach every student. It has a stated purpose to reach every student. Now that we have the definitions of both models, what does it matter? Though some of these distinctions between blended and flipped may seem subtle, the consequences of uncertainty are significant. If you're going to execute something well, you got to know what it is. Some have said that flipped learning is an easy method to get wrong, and you could probably say the same thing about blended learning. And I'm sure those who are kind of blending classes, you've seen this. This is the mistake I've seen. Oh, I blend because I showed an online video. Or people said the same thing. Oh, I flip my class because I've shown an online video. But it's so much richer. And let's be honest, the focus, what's the focus of both blended and flipped? I hope, and again, I'm no blended learning expert, it's really to get students involved in active learning, right? Research says, it'd be really, a famous quote by Dr. Patricia Cross from the University of California at Berkeley. She said that active learning is the grand meta principle. And the goal ultimately is to get active learning to happen in our classes. That's the goal. And I hope it's the goal of blended, and I know it's the goal of flipped, is let's get that involved. And so let me just close out with an interesting study that was done. In 2018, a survey of 15,000 college chemistry professors, they found that 25% of them self-reported that they were flipping their classes. And the study went on to make the connection that the vast majority of the flipped professors were doing deeper active learning strategies. That's what we're talking about, right? They stated this: Faculty use of flipped classrooms is significantly associated with the use of active learning strategies and instructional practices. Then they examined the 75% who were not flipping. They found that they were 16 times more likely to rely on lectures. My takeaway is that if you really want to bring active learning to your class, you got a 1 chance in 16 if you're not flipping, and if you are flipping, then you are more likely to do it. So if you will, flip learning, my take, all right? It's the easy way. The easy way to move, if you will, from passive, that's a problem in our educational system, to active learning. So blend or flip? I'd love to hear your comments.